Hello and welcome to the NADP UK presentation on UK online accessibility. My name's Gianne Wild. I'm the CEO of Accessibility Oz. You can probably tell from my accent that I am not from the UK. I am Australian, but Accessibility Oz, my company, does do a lot of work with UK organisations. And in fact, the accessibility requirements in the UK are quite similar to those in Australia. So check us out at accessibilityoz.com, but that's enough about me for now. Let's get on with it. So let's talk firstly about an overview of online accessibility. Firstly, what is a disability? According to the UK definition, it is a physical or mental impairment that has a substantial and long-term negative effect on one's ability to do normal daily activities. Now, be aware that substantial means more than minor or trivial, e.g. it takes much longer than it usually would to just complete a daily task like getting dressed, and long-term meaning 1 year or longer. So that's what disability is in the UK. But what is online accessibility? Online accessibility is the ability for a person with a disability to understand and use a website, application, intranet, mobile app or program, basically any kind of digital content. In the UK, it's governed by the Equality Act of 2010, including the Disability Discrimination Act 1995. And there is another document underneath it called the Public Sector Bodies, Websites and Mobile Applications Number 2, Accessibility Regulations 2018. But you don't need to worry about that. You definitely don't need to read those documents. What you need to know is how you achieve online accessibility. And basically you do so by following the W3C Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, version 2.1, level AA, and in some cases EN 301549, which is an EU requirement, and that kind of covers more things than digital. So say the physical accessibility of a photocopier, for example. And you can also look at ISO 3071-1. Now this doesn't tell you how to make things accessible, but sort of the processes that you can engage in your organisation to ensure online accessibility. So that's definitely worth looking at if you're in a management position. So what are the UK accessibility requirements? I've broken them up into public sector requirements and private sector requirements. So let's talk about public sector first off. What is the definition of a public sector? Let's just start with that. Public sector bodies include central government and local government organisations, some charities and other non-government organisations. According to the Act, it is organisations also that might not be defined as public sector, but that provide services that are essential to the public. Think electricity, phone service, etc. And also organisations that specifically address the needs of or are meant for people with disabilities. Okay, so your public sector, what do you need to do? You need to ensure your website is fully compliant or fully accessible to the W3C Web Content Accessibility Guidelines version 2.1 level AA. You also need to publish an accessibility statement that includes contact details for anyone who needs to make a complaint or has accessibility issues with your site. And you also need to update that accessibility statement regularly. There are specific timelines around public sector, and basically they're all prior to now. So new public websites needed to be accessible on launch. Current public websites need to be accessible now. Older public sector websites need to be accessible when they're updated, and mobile applications need to be accessible by the 23rd of June 2021. Now, there are some exemptions. The following organisations are fully exempt. Non-government organisations like charities, unless they're mostly financed by public funding, provide services that are essential to the public or aimed at people with disabilities. And public sector broadcasters and their subsidiaries. Those are organisations that are fully exempt, but there are also organisations that are partially exempt, and they include primary and secondary schools or nurseries, except for the content people need in order to use their services. For example, a form that lets you outline school meal preferences, etc. Now, partially exempt organisations still need to publish an accessibility statement referencing what is exempt and what isn't. There's also what we call a disproportionate burden. If the impact of meeting requirements is too much for an organisation to cope with, then you have this thing called a disproportionate burden, and you can actually argue that you don't need to make your content accessible. The thing that is important there, though, is that if your circumstances change, then you need to review if that's still the case. So how do you actually engage the disproportionate burden exemption? You need to carry out an assessment to determine what the level of burden is that making those things accessible places on your organisation, and also the benefits of making those things accessible. And only once you've done that assessment can you claim the disproportionate burden exemption. Now, an assessment should include things like your organisation's size and resources, the nature of your organisation, how much making things accessible would cost and the impact that would have on your organisation, how much disabled users would benefit from you making things accessible. You cannot take things like lack of time or knowledge into account in your assessment, or argue that accessibility is a disproportionate burden because you're not giving it a priority. You need to look at this as a serious issue. You're less likely to also be able to claim disproportionate burden for services that are specifically aimed at people with disabilities, and also for things that enable people to participate in society, like registering to vote or finding a job. And be aware that just because you do have a disproportionate burden exemption doesn't mean that you don't have to provide reasonable adjustments for people with disabilities. And so reasonable adjustments are things like providing alternative formats to PDF documents and stuff like that, providing information via phone as well as online, and interpreters for press conferences. So you still need to meet those requirements. Now, there's also content that is exempt from the accessibility regulations, and they're quite specific. So pre-recorded audio and video published before the 23rd of September 2020, live audio and video, heritage collections like scanned manuscripts, PDFs or other documents published before the 23rd of September 2018, unless users need them to use a service, for example, a form that lets you request school meal preferences. Maps, but you have to provide essential information in an accessible format like an address. And third-party content that's under someone else's control if you did not pay for it or develop it yourself. So things like social media like buttons. Content on intranets or extranets published before the 23rd of September 2019, unless you make a major revision. And archived websites if they're not needed for services your organisation provides and they're not updated. If you have not made content on your website accessible because it is exempt, you still need to publish an accessibility statement on your website or mobile app explaining that there's an exemption and exactly what has not been made accessible. Monitoring accessibility compliance. The Central Digital and Data Office monitor public sector bodies' compliance on behalf of the Minister for Cabinet Office by examining a sample of public sector websites and mobile apps every year. They can also request access to intranets and extranets and apps and things as well. If they decide that a public sector body has failed to publish an accessibility statement, or that the accessibility statement is incorrect, i.e. the accessibility statement says that the site is accessible when it isn't, they can publish the name of the body and a copy of the decision. In terms of enforcing accessibility compliance, there are various equal rights commissions in England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland that are responsible for enforcement, and they'll use their legal powers to litigate offending organisations under the Equality Act 2010 and the Disability Discrimination Act 1995. Now, if a user finds an accessibility issue, what should they do? They should raise it with the relevant organisation by using the contact details provided in the accessibility statement. If they don't receive a response or they're unhappy with their response, then they should contact their relevant equal rights opportunity organisations, which is the Equality Advisory and Support Service in England, Scotland and Wales, and the Equality Commission for Northern Ireland in Northern Ireland. So how does private sector differ? Firstly, let's talk about the definition of private sector. For this organisation, I'm sure we could have many a discussion about this, we're defining private sector as not public sector. What do you need to do? You actually need to do exactly the same things. You need to ensure your website is fully accessible to the W3C Web Content Accessibility Guidelines version 2.1 level AA. You need to publish an accessibility statement that includes contact details for anyone that needs to make a complaint, and you need to update that accessibility statement regularly. Now, why is this? There are specific requirements around public sector websites which talk about dates and all those kind of things. However, under the law, you need to not discriminate against people with disabilities. And it doesn't matter whether you're a public sector organisation or a private sector organisation. And so if you provide a website that is not accessible, you are by definition discriminating against people with disabilities. So therefore you're in violation of the Act. So all the same things apply. So just one note about EU accessibility requirements. I know the UK is not part of the EU. However, they can actually decide to opt in to the EU accessibility requirements. A decision around that hasn't been made yet. But having said that, your organisations probably do deal with European organisations as well. So knowing what the EU accessibility requirements are can be helpful. You need to follow 3 additional things: the EU Web Accessibility Directive, the European Accessibility Act, and EN 301-549. Now, the EU Accessibility Directive accords pretty closely with UK accessibility requirements, so that's not any additional work. Now, the European Accessibility Act applies to the private sector and kicks in mid-2022. So there's probably going to be some more things around requiring compliance and proving compliance for private sector organisations in the EU starting mid-2022. And EN 301-549, when it comes to digital content, it accords exactly the same as the W3C Web Content Accessibility Guidelines version 2.1. However, it's also extended, and it talks about things like the accessibility of photocopiers and other devices, mobile phones, telephones, etc. So that's something else that you can look at. Okay, so now you know what the rules are. I can imagine that you're going, well, what should I actually do? So this is what you need to do. You need to conduct an accessibility audit. Now, you can do that internally if you have knowledgeable staff, but in most cases, you will need to engage an external company to do that. And there are many companies, ours is just one of them, that can do that. I would just say when you're looking at an external company, ask for references, have a look at what they've done previously. Don't necessarily always go with the cheapest option. You need to then also educate your developers and content authors. Now, a company like ours can help you with that, but there's also a huge amount of information out there that's for free, and I'm going to give you some of that information a little bit later. Then you need to make accessibility fixes, whether they be development or content fixes, write an accessibility statement, and of course you need to rinse and repeat. You need to keep doing these things and listen to your users. It's absolutely essential that you keep your accessibility statement up to date and that you have contact details there, and the contact details are to an email address that someone will be looking at. If a client or a user has a problem with your website, you want to know. These people, they don't want to make life difficult. They want to just get to the information. They want to get to the content. And so if all they need is you to respond with an email and say, hey, it's here, or let me give you a Word document or something, they'll be thrilled. So listen to your users. Make sure your users can contact you. Okay, now I can imagine the next question is, well, there's a lot that I need to do and a lot that I've had to learn, but where do I start? Okay, so really the best way to start is research. So I'm going to give you a whole bunch of URLs, and I'm going to put these on a URL that you can get access to so that you can go off and read to your heart's content. Now, there's obviously a lot of other things that you could do if you have budget, but this is really my presentation for those people that don't have budget. If you have budget, then start talking to accessibility companies. That's really the way forward. Presentations, articles and webinars. I speak at a lot of conferences. We speak on a whole range of different topics: how to create accessible websites, mobile accessibility testing, how to make images accessible, etc. So there's heaps of that. The presentations are also online. articles, webinars. There's also a great organisation called 3Play Media, and they have free webinars. Now they're a video organisation. They do content captioning and audio description, so definitely have a look at them if you need that kind of assistance. But they also have webinars on all ranges of topics. And look at medium.com, so medium.com/tag/accessibility for articles on accessibility. Then there are mailing lists. WebAIM is fantastic. The Web Accessibility Interest Group is also great for a few more technical things. And Twitter, the hashtag A11Y, sometimes #accessibility, is also great. In terms of testing tools, instructional videos and policies, have a look at wave.webaim.org. That's fantastic. We've got these series of videos aimed at developers that are freely available. There's also a great organisation called Accessibility Switchboard, which has a whole bunch of things like how do you write policies and stuff like that. We have a series of accessibility fact sheets. How do you make images accessible? How do you make content accessible? How do you test? That kind of stuff. And we have an automated accessibility testing tool that we'd love to show you called AusArt as well. There's also some great accessible products that are free. Mostly. Grackle Docs is a document remediation product that basically turns Google Docs into accessible PDFs. You do have to pay for it at certain levels, but for the one-off document, it's free. We also have an accessible slideshow, so if you want a slideshow on your website, you're welcome to grab that and use that as you like. There's also a couple of free video players because your standard YouTube and Vimeo players are not accessible, and so one of them is ours called AusPlayer, which is free in most circumstances for not-for-profits. There is one that's free all the time called AblePlayer. There's also a site called EasyChirp, which shows Twitter feeds in an accessible way. That's something else that you could look at. There's also some great conferences and meetups. Global Accessibility Awareness Day was May 16th, but you can find all the recorded webinars. All this stuff is online now. There are web accessibility meetups everywhere. I spoke at the Web Accessibility Meetup in London in mid-2019, which was great. There's also an organisation called the International Association of Accessibility Professionals, and they have a series of webinars as well. And there's also what I call AusWiki, which is our database of accessibility errors, screenshots, code, and solutions. So really aimed at developers and testers and things like that. And usually you have to pay for that, but if you're interested in getting access, just send us an email and say that you heard it at this presentation, and we'll give you 6 months free access. Now, I know that's a lot of information and you must be like, well, I can't write down all those links all at once. So I've created a page which has these slides, and it also has all the links. Now that URL is pz.tt/NADP-UK. Everything you need is there, and if you have any accessibility issues accessing those slides or those links, just drop us an email at inquiries@accessibilityoz.com, or you can give us a call on our international number +617 3123 5951. Thank you so much for listening to this presentation. I hope it's been helpful, and all this information that I've talked about today is readily available online. The UK government has fantastic resources, so I've provided links to those pages as well, so you can refer to the official versions of these documents. Anyway, thank you so very, very much. I've really enjoyed doing this presentation. I love working with the UK, and I hope to talk to you soon. I hope to hear from you. Let me know what you think. I'm happy to help in any way that I can, and I hope that you enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you very much.